we are in the middle of our. I just was about to say next step. We're in the middle of our Thrive series, and we're looking at these different aspects of our life that we can thrive in when we turn them over to God, when we submit it to Him, and do it His way versus our way. And as I was thinking about that, I one of the reasons we're doing that this week, I was actually going to do this sermon next week, and next week we're going to do Thriving in Our Mind. We're going to do that this week, but I switched it because this week we're kind of doing something with a bunch of churches throughout Utah, focusing on Loving Utah. You guys have probably heard me mention Loving Utah at some point, but I kind of want to just give a little background as kind of how it connects, why it made me switch the time aspect, or the sermon title aspect. We, about 6 years ago, we finished this building. And in that time, right after we finished the building, the shepherds and I discussed that I should take a sabbatical for a time to just kind of renew and spend some time in prayer. And, we'd kind of come through a big vision thing and now get ready. What's our next big vision step? And in ministry, that's something that happens quite often every so few many years. A lot of times pastors will take a little break like that to not just, it's not like a vacation, but more of a step away from the week-to-week teaching aspect so you can really focus on some bigger picture things. And in doing that, one of the things that God really gave me was that we needed to not do something new, but we needed to kind of go back to something that we had said was a part of our vision, but we could tell we were kind of getting away from. And that was the idea of having a kingdom impact past Heber. And so about that time, about a year later, when I got back from the sabbatical, within a year from then, we started our Camas campus. We made the decision that we were going to be serious about that and get out there and start the Camas campus. And that's been going great. But another aspect of that was I started thinking about, well, what are we going to do as a church to really be a part of that bigger than that? Because if just us going out and doing campuses, we might at some point have 5, 6, even 7 or 10 campuses. But we could do so much more if we partner with people. And the reason I wanted to switch this sermon to talking about thriving in our time is because one of the things that hit me with that is I realized as a church, we only have so much time. God's church will last forever, but little individual churches, they have a season. They last for 20, 30, 50, 70 years. But there's a season. And in my life, I only have a certain amount of time. And I thought, that's great that we're doing Camas, and maybe we'll get another one, and now we have Gateway going. But I thought, how could we have even more impact? And so I was meeting with a group of people called Pastor to Pastors. There was a guy who, his whole ministry out here was he just met with as many pastors as he could and formed them in groups and kind of helped us do ministry together, because Utah is a very lonely place to do ministry. Well, in that group of people, I got talking with a few, and there was a group of us that had like-mindedness that said, hey, we want to have a bigger impact. And so together we formed Loving Utah. And so I've been on the board of Loving Utah now for 5 years. That's basically since its inception. Last year we were able to hire full-time a director, one of the guys that was on the board. Now he's a director. And Loving Utah basically recruits people to Utah, trains leaders in Utah, resources churches, and helps plant churches and get churches strong. With the idea that there's so many churches in Utah that they're just kind of surviving. They're not really thriving in any way. So our goal is to get churches from surviving to thriving to multiplying. And we're going to talk about that at the end of the sermon. But I wanted to just kind of preface with, that's kind of why I decided to switch this week, because that idea that what's important to do with our time. And Loving Utah is really about kind of me looking at it and saying, what's an important thing for us to do as a church with our time? As a church, we only have so much time. We have to say yes to the right things. But I want to talk today about more specifically us as individuals. How do we thrive in our time? With the time that God's given us, how do we use it to the very best? Use it for His glory. So I want to, as I was thinking about that this week, a metaphor that it gets used a few times in the New Testament came to mind. And that's the metaphor of running a race. Right? Paul uses that. The writer of Hebrews uses it. And that idea that, hey, your life is like this race. Your life is this thing you're trying to get through. And how do you do it really well? And so there's three different places we see this metaphor used. And so I want us to just look at that. What do these authors say we need to do if we're going to thrive in this life? So for the first one, if you want to turn your Bibles, we're going to look at Philippians 2, starting at verse 14 and 14 through 16. Philippians 2, verse 14 through 16. It says this, towards the end of verse 14. It says, "Do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe as you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor for nothing." So this is Paul writing, right? And he's writing to the church of Philippi. And what he's telling these people is, if you look at in the context of this whole passage, he's basically giving them some instruction of like, hey, here's how you are to live. And why? So notice what he says here. He says, do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you become pure and blameless, that you'd be children of God without fault in this crooked and depraved generation. And what does he say happens when we do that? We shine like stars, right? So Paul's saying, look, if you will seek God and live out the gospel, basically, is what he's saying, live out the gospel as you hold on to the word of life, right? That's what the word of life is. All the scholars agree. When he's talking about the word of life, he's talking about the gospel. If you live out the gospel, putting aside complaining and arguing, and really live out what God calls you to do, you're going to live out that gospel. And when you do that, you shine like stars. And he says, I want you to do that because I ran my life, I ran my race in order to pass that on to you. And I want you to make sure I didn't do that in vain. Don't just let it stop with me, he's saying. You pass it on to others now. This isn't just something I was doing. I want you to pass this on. And what Paul's trying to tell them is, look, don't just live this life. Live it with purpose. Live life with purpose. You know, we're all called to live out the gospel. And when we live out the gospel, we shine like stars. Now, does that mean that everyone has to be a preacher, or everyone has to lead worship, or whatever it is? No, it doesn't mean any of that. What it means is, if we live out as he's calling us to live out here, no matter where we are, no matter what our context is, we're doing ministry. Everything, everywhere you're at, in your neighborhood, at work, in the clubs or groups that you're a part of, if you live out the gospel, you're ministering, you're shining like a star. People are drawn to that. And isn't that so true? I mean, if you're in your workplace and you have hope, if you're in your workplace and you're able to keep peace in the midst of like really bad times, if you're able to not get negative about hard things, if you're able to find joy in things, you shine like a star in this world, right? And that draws people to Jesus. And Paul's saying, you have a purpose, and that is to shine like a star. Don't let me run my race in vain by just having passed it on to you and having it stop there. But make it be something by passing it on to others, simply by living in such a way that you draw people to Christ. Right? So we live this life with purpose, and it's unique for every one of us. It's the same purpose, but we each do it uniquely. Right? We each have our different place. We each have our different area that we do this in. But then we see this same metaphor much stronger, actually, in this next passage. We see it in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. So if you have your Bibles, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. We're going to look at verse 24 through 27. 1 Corinthians 9, 24 through 27 says this. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone competes in the game. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last. But we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. No, I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. See, Paul's saying, look, we're running a race. So when you're running that race, be focused on how you're running. Run in such a way as to get the prize. Right? As I was thinking about this, I was thinking about Kobe Bryant, who passed away 2 weeks ago. I'm going to empty my pockets. I'm sorry, I forgot to do that. It's driving me nuts. I was thinking about Kobe Bryant, who passed away a couple weeks ago. And, Kobe Bryant was probably one of the greatest basketball players to ever live. And chances are, he was a talented and gifted man, right? And chances are, just based on his talent and gift alone, if Kobe Bryant played basketball 2 days a week, he probably would have been better than the average person, right? He probably would have been able to beat almost anybody. But he didn't get to be one of the greatest of all time by just talent and giftedness alone. He got there by disciplining himself and turning his body and mind into a basketball playing machine, right? I mean, I watched a little bit on him and hearing some things that people said, and just his dedication to being the greatest at literally like the age of 7, right? And how quickly he just decided that's what he wanted to do. And see, that's what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, look, if we're going to really thrive in this life, we have a purpose, and we're never going to achieve that purpose unless we live intentionally. We need to live intentionally. Kobe Bryant got to be the greatest because he was intentional. It didn't just happen, right? He didn't just aimlessly do things. He was focused, right? Wasn't just running around aimlessly. I love that the idea of Paul talks about it, not like a person beating the air. Every time I read that, I always think of walking through a spider web. You ever walk through a spider web, right? Or see someone walk through a spider web, and they're just like if you see them, they just look like they're just aimlessly like beating the air, right? And I picture that, and Paul's saying, don't do that. Have a purpose in what you're doing and be intentional about it. Live intentionally. There's a saying that says there are those that let life happen, those that make life happen, and those who wonder what happened. Right? Chances are you know a few people that just kind of go through life and they wonder what happened. But probably most of us at least have areas and times in life when we kind of are just letting life happen. And if we want to really thrive, we have to make life happen. We have to choose to be intentional about living out our faith. It isn't going to just happen without being focused on it. As I was thinking about this living intentionally, the word that struck me as kind of an opposite of living intentionally is living instinctually, living by instincts. I got a dog this year, and so we've always had little dogs, right? And little, if you have little dogs, I'm sorry, I always call them rat dogs, right? We've always had little rat dogs, and I love them. I've never really been a little dog fan, but I've learned to kind of love our dogs. And but one passed away a year ago, and the other one, she's getting old, and we moved, and we have a little bit of land now, and I said, I'm going to get a real dog. And when I was going to get a real dog, I wanted it to be a manly dog, right? I'm going to get a manly dog. And I had a black lab growing up, and I loved my black lab, and my brother's calling me. I'm so sorry. I'm up on him. I usually turn my phone off. I forgot. But I got this black lab, and I was excited to get him. And I thought, I'm going to name him this manly name, right? So I named him Creed. I thought that's a cool, manly name, right? I'm a big Rocky movie fan, and Apollo Creed and the new Creed movies, right? So I was like, name him Creed. And Creed's like the biggest doofus. I should have named him Groot. That's what our family says, because he's just like, hey, Groot, right? He's just like this dumb dog. He's so sweet, but he's just not, he's not like this tough dog at all. Like my son has 2 dogs he brought to the house, and Creed outweighs him by like probably 10, 15 pounds each, and he's totally submissive to both of them. They both just boss him around. The little dog bosses him around, right? But that's Creed. But you know what? Creed is, he lives by his instincts. That dog, I've never seen something controlled by its stomach more than he is. And he lives by that. And because of that, he's really easy to train. Right? Because I can just give him kibble. I don't even got to give him treats. Just a little piece of dog food. And he will sit, he'll stay, he'll come, he'll do all those things because he's like, I'm going to get a little piece of food, right? And he's very excited about it. He lives by his instincts, right? We're not called to be people that live by our instincts. We're called to be intentional. I was thinking about, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about my son-in-law, Danny. He runs Big Canyon Ranch Camp up in Colville. And last year, they had a mouse problem. They had a really bad mouse problem in the kitchen. And he was telling me about the trap that they made for the mice. And so I actually Googled it, and I YouTubed it and watched. And it's called a bucket trap. And it basically is just a ramp on either side of this bucket that goes up with a rod going through a free spinning rod that goes through the bucket, and some water that you put in the bucket, and then some peanut butter you just rub on the rod. And these mice, and sure enough, he told me, he goes, yeah, we catch like 7 or 8 in one night with this. And so I YouTubed it, and sure enough, this one guy, he got 16. I say caught, right? Because you might not like what really happened, but they got all these mice. And I watched this one video, the guy got 16 mice in one night. And you watch these mice, and you're thinking, see, I've heard all these things about how they use mice for research because they're supposed to be smart and they can learn. I don't know if that's true. Because I was watching this video, and these mice, they climb up there, and they go to the peanut butter, and it spins, and they fall in, right? And there's 16 of them in there. Now, with one, I'll give one. I'll go, okay, it makes sense. He saw it, didn't know, fell in. I'll even let the second one by, because the second one probably saw the first. I can see him going, hey, you know what? I see that one. I'm smarter than him. I can do this. He falls in. I'll even give the third one credit because he could say, well, I know him. I'm smarter than him. And I know him. And I'm in better shape than him. I think I can do this. He falls in. But at some point, you'd think these mice would learn, right? That, hey, there's 8 other mice dead in this bucket, right? And if you watch the video, they even literally will watch each other do it, and then they'll go and do it. So somehow they're not learning. They're just living by their instinct of, I see it, I know I want it, I'm going to go get it. And they're not being intentional. They're not thinking. We are called to be intentional. We're called to not just live by our desires, not just live by, hey, I want this, so I have to go get it. We need to be intentional. If we're going to thrive in this life, we need to learn to focus ourselves. We need to look at the temptations that we face. See, we can think how stupid those mice are, but how many people live the same way? How many people, you probably know people that you're like, man, I've watched you go across that area, you keep falling in the bucket. Right? You keep falling for the exact same thing, and you know better. But how many times do I do that? How often do I keep making the same mistake? I've got to be intentional, right? I'm not going to lose weight by having a good, having a good intention. I actually have to be intentional, right? I'm not going to run aimlessly with my diet and lose weight. It just doesn't happen. If you know how to do that, if you just know how to aimlessly eat whatever you want and lose weight, please tell me, because I would love that plan, right? I have to be intentional if I'm going to do that. I have to be focused if I'm going to do that. Same thing goes with temptation. How many of us as Christians we just kind of hope somehow we're going to overcome temptations without being intentional, without doing the things that God calls us to do, surrounding ourselves with others and sharing our weaknesses with others so that they can help us and guide us, reading God's Word, being regularly involved, not just with regular weekend services, but actually kind of in a group where you have people that you can talk to and share with. Right? We need to be intentional in our living if we're going to thrive in this life. And when we do, we begin to see that our life has bigger purpose. So often we're just so busy running around aimlessly, we can't see the purpose that God has for us. Because we just keep falling into the bucket. But once we start really putting these things into place, we begin to see His purpose, and we begin to see that we can live for something bigger. Finally, look at Hebrews 12. Hebrews 12, verse 1 and 2. I love this one. It says this. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before Him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. I love the visual language of this verse. First of all, what does he say? Since we're surrounded by this great crowd of witnesses, what he's talking about is believers from the past that we can learn from, and believers in the present that we're with. See, this race is never meant to be lived out alone. It's not a race that we're meant to run alone. Have you ever done something with an audience versus doing it by yourself? Doing it by yourself, you can do it and you do good. But man, when you've got people like cheering you on and saying you can do this, and knowing, believing in you, encouraging you, helping you through it, man, it makes a difference, doesn't it? It motivates you. It encourages you. We're meant to do this with other people. We're not meant to do this alone. Right? So that's the first part of what he says. But then what does he say? He says, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, so that we can run with perseverance the race marked out for us. And I think what he's saying here, when I think about that, throwing things off, the sin that entangles us, is that we need to live free. We need to live free of the sin that entangles us. See, because when I picture that idea of this runner running, and they've got all this stuff on them, right? And they just can't run the same, right? But when they throw that stuff off, man, how much better can they run? How much more free can they run the race? If we're going to run this race, we have to run free. We have to live free. And he says when we do that, we throw off these things, we're able to run the race, what? That we run aimlessly? No. The race that is marked out for us. That God has a plan. God has a purpose for us. And when we throw these things off, we're able to see that. We're able to run the race that's marked out for us. And how do we do that? By fixing our eyes on Jesus. I love that idea of fixing our eyes on Jesus. You know, when I learned to ride a motorcycle, the first thing I learned was you don't look directly in front of you. Right? It kind of, for some people, that's kind of their instinct. They want to look right in front of them. But one, if you're looking just right in front of you, you can't see what's coming. But what you want to do is you actually want to look out. You want to fix your eyes on your path. Fix your eyes 30, 40, 70 feet in front of you. And when you fix your eyes there, it's amazing. Your bike just naturally goes there. Because where do we go? We go where we're looking, don't we? Right? You don't want to look at the thing you're trying to avoid, right? You don't want to look right at the car that's going to come by you. When you look at the thing you're trying to avoid, you actually hit that thing. We want to fix our eyes on where we're going. But so often we're kind of looking around at all the other stuff, aren't we? And we're not running the race that's marked out for us. Instead, we're diverted to all these other things. See, sin entangles us. Some sin, the entanglement of some sin is really obvious. And it's easy for us to kind of look at that and go, oh, yeah, and we feel bad for certain people that they're entangled in certain sins, right? Drug addiction, alcoholism, sex addiction, those kinds of things. We kind of look and go, oh, yeah, man, you just see the ways that they're going. You're like, oh, that's just, they're gonna fall. But the truth is, all sin entangles us. Right? See, the temptation tells us, hey, when I'm sinning, I'm living free. I'm living how I want to live. No one's telling me how to live, right? I'm not gonna listen to religion. I don't gotta listen to my mom and dad. I don't gotta listen to other people. Whatever it is, right? I live how I want to live. But the truth is, that's what's entangling us. It's when we get rid of these things and we shed them, that's when we're actually free to live out the exciting life that God has for us, the thriving life that God has for us. And unless we throw those things off, it just starts to grip us tighter and tighter and tighter. Now here's the thing, it's a moving target, isn't it? I can't remember the day I lived free from sin. Now I live in freedom with Christ, but I can't remember the day that I went through and went, wow, I made it all day. That was cool. Not one sin. Right? I think there was a day I thought I did, but my wife reminded me of them. Right? I can't remember that day. It's a moving target, but it's this constant idea that we're constantly seeking to rid ourselves of these things so that we can pursue Jesus as we're called to. So I guess this evening, I just want to ask you, with your life, you only have so much time. Looking around this room, most of you, a lot of you that probably still aren't thinking about this yet. But you only have so much time in this life. Are you seeking to thrive in it? Because if you are, you need to know that God has a purpose for it. That God has called you to shine His light by how you live. And that can't happen haphazardly. It only happens intentionally. And if we want to be intentional about it, then we have to throw off the sin. We have to constantly seek to turn that over to Him. And not just let it entangle us. Because as long as we're entangled in it, we'll never really be able to thrive as He calls us to thrive. I mentioned Cody Bryant earlier, and I'm sure when Cody Bryant was growing up, there was lots of temptations to sit and play video games instead of learn how to play basketball better. I'm sure there was lots of temptation to go hang out with friends versus work on his game. Lots of temptations to get distracted by other things and not focus on what he knew he wanted. What do you want? Do you want the thriving life that God calls you to? Because it doesn't happen on purpose. On accident. It happens when we live it out intentionally.